Welcome, everybody. This is Solomon. I'm here interviewing Weronika Kuzniar on three books that she's worked on: Albion and Zion United, Moloch, Yahweh, the Circumcised Moses, and Judah Antichrist, a look behind the scenes of the world political stage. Thank you, Veronica, for taking the time to speak with me regarding these three books. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, as we were talking before the interview, I really enjoyed reading these books. And again, these books are important, I think, for what is happening today in our political world. And also, I mentioned how this kind of wakes people up out of this kind of fantasy world of a Christian America. What's kind of, we're talking about probably the most that would really shock a lot of people, the Moloch Yahweh book, the circumcised Moses, the concept that Yahweh is really Moloch. And that's at some point in the Old Testament, there was a merging of these two deities into one. So what do you think is, when did this happen and why, the merging of Moloch and Yahweh?
Okay, so this was originally written by a Third Reich scholar named Wilhelm Mathiesen. And so it's his thesis. This isn't me speaking, this is his research speaking. However, it's very interesting and he is very well sourced. So he does cite and reference everything he says. He doesn't just pull it out of the wool. So according to him, it was likely during what he calls the prophetic age. The Bible was basically retouched by the Jews themselves, by their priestly caste. And it was done in order to cleanse the name of Moloch and that image, which entailed child sacrifice, to make Yahweh, their God, more palatable to non-Jews. But the main reason, the initial reason, was to prevent Jews from exterminating their own selves. So the priestly class did not want Jews sacrificing their firstborn any longer because they realized this was self-immolation. So they had to transfer that sacrificial custom, as it were, to something else. And what they ended up doing was transferring it to the Gentiles. So it was okay to kill the firstborn or even just any Gentiles, but it wasn't any longer okay to kill Jews, for Jews to kill Jews. So the prophets wanted the Jews to be saved from themselves. And this is why you constantly see the theme of you will eat all peoples. It's not like literally they're going to eat other people. It's this idea of devouring and destroying other people. And the reason why the Jews were kind of sicked on everyone else is because they devour their own selves unless they have that need put elsewhere, basically. So their ruling class, their priestly class, did just that. In the process of turning Moloch into Yahweh by name only, that's a very important part of this whole, I guess you'd call it like a paradigm shift in Judaism. So Moloch evolves into Yahweh to prevent further ritual sacrifice of Jews among themselves. And he segues into this idea called the ban. And I will just read a little bit of what Mathiesen writes, because it's really important. So he says, even to this day, one can see that Jewish blood is heatedly reminiscent of this self-slaughter in Molochism. Today, Yahweh and Moloch are still one. And of course, he wrote this in the 1940s. Of course, the prophets as saviors of Israel and guardians of the Jewish race would never admit that they were once one. Their task was to present the new purified worship of Yahweh as the original and all other cults as deviations from Yahweh. Only in this way can their terrible accusations against Judah be understood. They never wanted to eradicate what was Jewish, but rather, on the contrary, to save it from impending extermination, to breed it even purer through the new Yahweh cult, and above all, to weld the Jewish mixed race more firmly through this unity of belief in the race demon, to make it more resilient, even immortal. So they were by no means anti-Semites, but exactly what we call the wise men of Zion. So when you hear the priests like Ezekiel and Moses and Hosea castigating Jewry in the name of Yahweh, like, oh, Israel, you hurt my feelings because you put kings before me and all this, it's not genuine. It's that they want the Jews to stop self-immolating. This is simply to bring Jewry back in line to the true Judaism. It has nothing to do with taking them away from Yahweh or making them better people. And so then when we get into chapter 5, which is page 31, Yahweh gives his bandits, his people, a complete substitute for the hitherto popular self-eating, and that's child sacrifice to Moloch. He directed the Jewish murder instinct to the non-Jewish peoples, and at the same time satisfied the Jewish superstition, which could not be abandoned from human sacrifice. He evaluates every murder of a non-Jew as a Yahweh sacrifice. And so we have every right to describe all Jewish genocides as ritual murders. Ritual murder took the place of Moloch sacrifice. That sums it up very well, I think.
Wow. And it's, yeah. And, you know, the point you were making about the prophets, how they're castigating the Jews, like you said, it's really to bring them further into Yahwehism, not to separate them from that. Like if you think of today, there's this, with everything that's going on in Israel, people that are still not getting it will point out the Orthodox Jews that are against Zionism. But just like the prophets of old, they're not against Zionism as an idea. They're just against the way the modern state of Israel is going about it. They still want the same thing. They're just disagreeing with the road to get there. And, you know,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. It's all disingenuous, basically.
Yes, exactly. And so this merging of Moloch and Yahweh, do you notice that once this merging is kind of complete, that now this God turns towards no longer, you know, the Jews eating of each other, devouring each other, so to speak, but now going after the Goyim, the Gentiles?
Yes, and I think when he gets into the subsequent chapter, which this is kind of jumping ahead, but the priestly corruption of the scripture, chapter 6, the whole idea, the whole point of sanitizing the Bible and turning Moloch into Yahweh and redirecting the Jews outward was to turn everyone else into worshipers of their God, into artificial Jews, as it were. So it became this process of Judaizing all Gentiles, bringing them under the umbrella of Judaism unwittingly.
Yes, and you know, we talked about it before, and that this goes to like Albion and Zion United, with the early infiltration of the British Empire, the, you know, through the nobility, then eventually the Parliament, and this transfer of the Judeo worldview to Britain, and now it's in America, and it's really all over the West, and using that British Israelite doctrine to Judaize Britain and Judaize America, again to further the goal of Zionism. And it's almost like Christianity can't get out of this Jewish octopus. Like you know, most of Christianity, at least in the West, is very Judaized. It's very in the clutches of Yahwehism, as probably even the more traditional versions of Christianity, like the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church. So, in your view, is this the goal of the Jews? Is not I know it's to destroy Christianity, but do they accomplish the same thing by just basically making it kosher, Judaizing it, giving it a Zionist like eschatology and Zionist worldview?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a substitute to its destruction. So if they can't undermine it, they're going to destroy it. But I think they have effectively undermined most of it with Christian Zionism. But there's kind of something interesting. So Matizan, the author, mentions democracy also. Kind of the introduction of democracy as a political matter, and Molochism is a religious matter, both of which emanate from Jewry. So you kind of see the introduction of democracy and this idea that everyone can have a voice and there shouldn't be an aristocracy or any kind of nobility ruling over any kind of people or empire. That kind of comes into play at the same time that the Jews are Judaizing everybody and bringing them under the umbrella of worshiping their God, which is, again, Moloch. They use the term Yahweh. And he does get into the etymology a little bit, which is interesting in a footnote. So people can look into that. In this thought on democracy being exclusively Jewish in nature ties in with what Gaston Ritter writes in Judah Antichrist. So Jews aim to destroy monarchy and the church in order to secure world power. So this has always and ever been about their promise from Moloch that they will rule the world. Moloch literally tells the Jews, you will rule, but never be ruled. And that's in the Bible. Anybody can look at it. Of course, it's attributed to Yahweh, but we all know who he is now. So the way they do this, which is really explored in Judah Antichrist, but I'd say even more so in Albion and Zion United, I mean, the three books really go together, is the Manchester capitalism of England, which the Jews already had the wealth and the English already had the Calvinist ideology. So capitalism just took off in England because that mindset was already there. This idea that wealth meant God's blessings, and that because you were predestined, you were wealthy, you were chosen by God already, this idea of chosenness. There was no sin that you could commit that would condemn you to hell. All you had to do was remedy that sin by doing good works post facto, which is exactly why Jews do philanthropy. They're real big on that. They have to keep their account book balanced with Moloch to make sure there's not too many negatives versus positives. So we have Manchester capitalism, which is those horrible stories about child labor and just horrific, gross exploitation of workers, which emerges from England in particular. It was the worst of the worst. And Bolshevism. These are the two entities, the two heads of the Jewish coin that are going to converge on Western Europeans in particular, on the West, to put them under Jewish rule. And the two feed into each other. High finance and capitalism made Bolshevism happen. Stalin even remarked on it with a smirk. He basically said, without capitalism, we wouldn't exist.
Well, they've accomplished their mission, because you talk to any American, or your average American, I should say, especially a Christian, they despise monarchy. They despise the concept of a monarchy, and they love capitalism. Capitalism is like, to them, God's economy, and as you said, it's very Calvinistic. The whole Protestant work ethic concept, and again, the chosen people ideology that Calvinism has with Judaism. And of course, the Puritans were Calvinists, and they came from England, and they brought a very Jewish worldview to America with the Sunday Sabbath laws, and very the witch persecutions, allegedly, the alleged witches that they persecuted. Very Old Testament oriented in the way they practice their Christianity. And from the beginning, in the other books that you've translated, reading about how these Puritan pastors were welcoming rabbis to come teach at universities. They didn't even care if they believed in Christ. They believed in a future Jewish millennium, and they envisioned Hebrew to be the national language of America in the future. So again, it goes back to what I was mentioning, that we have this idea of a Christian country that America was founded as being, but it was meant to be Judaized from the beginning. And obviously this goes further even back to the Protestant Reformation, which E. Michael Jones calls a Jewish looting job, which divided Europe, Christian Europe, into two camps. And one of the main goals of Protestantism was to make Christianity more Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like I said, democracy and capitalism are the gods of the American Christian.
Right. And it's almost like a bane on America that it was the English that founded it, that it became a country based on English colonists, because you see, it was doomed from the beginning. And I think it's in Albion and Zion United where the author talks about how, actually, it might be in Judah Antichrist. I'm not sure which one, but the author talks about how the pinnacle of power, if you will, I think it's Judah Antichrist, actually, it transferred directly from London to New York. So I think the Jews kind of sensed that America was going to rise to heights that even the British Empire was not going to see, in kind of a different way, in that it was really like a bastion for capitalism, that would be its whole identity, basically. And so that's why they transferred the power. So what you see happen is the Jewish exilarch, the three wise men, and the Council of 300, who were originally based in London, shift their base to New York. And these are allegedly the entities that rule the world, probably to this day. They certainly did in Gaston Ritter's day. And he's the one that wrote Judah Antichrist. And that was in 1940s, World War II's going on. And then, of course, you have Freemasonry, which was hijacked by Jewry with the sole aim of destroying religion, namely Christianity, and introducing liberalism. It was originally laicism that becomes liberalism. That feeds right into the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, Illuminism. Liberalism is literally the child or the bastard child of the lodge. And it was released unto the masses specifically to secularize them and make them atheists, so that the only thing that they would care about was wealth.
Exactly.
It all feeds in. You see, this kind of goes in hand with the whole America, capitalism, Jewry.
Right, and the reason of many of our, corporations leaving the States because of that cheap labor they can get elsewhere, and the wars that we're having all over, especially in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
And this American empire, which looks like it's starting to decline. Now, where do you see the Roman Catholic Church in all this? Like, were they one of the primary targets of the Zionists or were they kind of working with the Zionists, and then now it's the time for the Pope, the Roman Pope, to hand the baton to the Jewish, will be the Jewish world Pope? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion envision a Jewish world sovereign. Where do you see the Roman Catholic Church in all this? Was it a true opposition, but now it's kind of fallen under the hand of Jewry, or was it all along working with them? It seems to me, like from reading Judah Antichrist, the Roman Catholic Church was the primary opposition to the Zionists, and that was the number one institution, at least in the West, that they had to go after in order to break down the monarchy, and then the concept of, the belief in God. Because I know a lot of people claim to be Christian in America, but largely the practice of Christianity in America is very atheistic, capitalistic. So what's your views on the Roman Catholic Church within this, the rise to power of the Zionists?
I agree with you. I think most evidence points to an initially anti-Jewish church. The only problem with the Catholic worldview is that they believe that because the Jews rejected Moloch Yahweh, that now the Catholics are the Israelites, that they're going to inherit the blessings of Moloch Yahweh. So we still need to have a complete break between Jesus Christ's New Testament, and even a lot of the New Testament is problematic, which the Nazis found and expunged. That's how they came up with the Nazi Bible. They did an immense amount of research to rectify the New Testament. They completely expunged the Old Testament, and Christ was effectively Aryanized. I have one contact from Ukraine who emigrated here, and he has a very interesting perspective on the truth about Jesus, that he wasn't Jewish. There's some good research in that direction that the Nazis also likely would have probably found similar research as far as what they were citing to back that. So that's kind of an interesting little anecdotal thing that somebody might be interested in looking into. So the problem is really that Old Testament, the Torah. It is 100% Jewish. And you really can't have that in any kind of Christian movement, because if you go with the Moloch Yahweh thesis, the Catholics are worshiping Moloch.
Yeah, and even the Catholic Church now, post Vatican II, is totally sympathetic to the Jews. I went to a Catholic mass the other day, and they had a special prayer for the Jews, and the priest said that the Jews were the first ones God spoke to. And I would have never heard this before growing up in the Catholic Church. And to your point about, I think you've heard about it before, and it's mentioned in a couple of the books that I believe it's mentioned in Positive Christianity, is that Marcion actually put together the first New Testament, and it was pretty much Paul's writings, but without the Judaized portions, and without the Revelation, which is John's writings, or the Gospels, but really some of Paul's epistle. The Marcionites believed that the Yahweh of the Old Testament was evil, and that the God of Jesus Christ was not the same God as the God of the Old Testament. So would you say that the Marcion version of Christianity, which is still active today, actually, do you think that's the solution for Christians trying to get out of this Jewish web?
I would have to say that's probably the only possibility, because everything else is these people, all these Christian Zionists, especially the evangelicals, they think that they have to defend and die for Israel, and that it's some kind of fulfillment of prophecy to support Israel. It just couldn't be further from the truth. These people have lied to the entire world and constructed such a devious narrative based on their religion. It's really remarkable how they were able to use kind of the underworld of the Greco-Roman Empire to really usher in their version of quote unquote Christianity, and to hijack the whole thing, to basically turn everyone into artificial Jews. But people really need to read that Moloch Yahweh book, where he gets into that, how they subverted through the masses, especially in the Roman Empire, and how they took religious concepts that were already there among the Aryans and perverted them to Jewish ends, so that these Aryans would all be beholden to Jewry. So yes, I agree with you. I think that any kind of Christianity that is just 100% non-Jewish is going to be hopeful. And yeah, I agree with you with the Catholics now. the current Pope is absolutely an abomination.
Yes, and that's the thing that, like you said, that just the fact in Catholics, whether it's pre-Vatican II, post-Vatican II, they do consider themselves like the spiritual Israelites, and it's still you. Once you identify as we're the chosen people, you're still in the Yahweh web.
Right.
You're actually playing into their hands, such as a Christian identity concept, or the Black Hebrew Israelites. They think they're getting over on the Jews. Well, imitation is the best form of flattery. You're actually playing into their hands, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
That, and going to the Old Testament, right? And talking about the 20th century and the brutality of the Bolsheviks, of the communists, and they speculate 100 million murders of communists, of just whether it's Europeans or even in China.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the brutality of Bolshevik violence, and in Jude Antichrist, Father Gaston Ritter, details a few stories. Do you think this is a direct manifestation of this Yahweh God in the Old Testament, like that type of the nature of that brutal violence?
I would say absolutely. The world probably has not witnessed any kind of horrors or war crimes equivalent to what the Soviet Union did from its beginning to its end in at least all of recent history. I know that a lot of medieval torture methods in war was horrible, and there were some very inhuman things that were done to victims. But the Bolsheviks pretty much take the cake on torture and war crimes. And if we look at the Jewish view of non-Jews, they basically see us as animals. This is a repeated theme, not only in the Old Testament, but in their Talmud. It gets even worse in many of the different books. I mean, there's many different books that the Jews rely on, their religious books that most Gentiles are not familiar with. And they all talk very, very nastily about Gentiles. So it's pretty much a free for all. And I don't think anyone can possibly dispute the Jewish character of Bolshevism and Menshevism. Most people don't even mention that anymore. The Menshevist Trotskyites. Trotsky and Lenin were both incidentally Freemasons. So that's just something to keep in mind when people go, oh, capitalism and Freemasonry have nothing to do with communism. That's just one of the greatest lies ever told. The three are completely intertwined and interdependent on one another. But yes, it's unbelievable what the Jews did in Russia. And it was illegal to even use the word Jew. One could go to a gulag for 10, 15 years simply for calling a Jew in the Soviet Union. So if people think that it's going to be just this wonderful little liberal paradise here in America once Jews have complete control, you are quite mistaken, people. Anybody that thinks that is just utterly ignorant. Look at what happens when they rule people. And this is a repeated pattern back to the Bible.
Yes,
Absolutely rooted in their Molochism, yes.
and the brutality of the Old Testament. And I know you're really familiar with history and tribes, and I know you're really familiar on the racial question in terms of like the different races and phenotypes. But in studying history, from what I've read, and tribal wars between different groups, there seems to be in the Old Testament a unique brutality that I don't read. I'm not saying it's never been carried out by other peoples, but there seems to be a uniqueness about the brutality of the Old Testament. And we have the 20th century, the Bolshevik communist revolutions, and that we see that brutality. And the Roman Catholic Church at times has been very brutal because they're carrying this motif of Old Testament, type of culture and violence. The Protestants did the same thing to the Anabaptists, and then when they came over here with the Native Americans. So there seems to be a unique brutality with the Old Testament and how it spawned these brutal Christian movements. And now, Islam is a daughter of the Old Testament, and now the current Zionism. We see the genocide in Palestine. Do you feel that this violence of the Old Testament, this kind of violent nature of the Yahweh God, is unique when you have studied like other tribes and their wars and their battles? Is there something uniquely grotesque about this type of violence?
I'm going to have to say yes yeah, because even if you look at English warfare, which is extremely brutal, what they did to Germany in World War II, just the most recent example, it was greatly inspired by the Jews in the aristocracy, the Sassoons, the Opium War. The behavior of the English was so heavily influenced by the Jews and by their weird brand of Christianity there. I'd say you can't really examine anyone's warfare as theirs alone until or unless you can divorce the Jewish influence there. So I'm going to have to say yes. The Jewish influence adds an element of brutality that just isn't there. I've studied Chinese warfare and European warfare prior to the immense Jewish presence. And yeah, you have rapine and whatnot. It's just, even with the Romans, before the Jews really took over the Roman Empire, and it still doesn't come close to what is alleged against Jews and whoever they're part of. American conduct, Russian conduct, English conduct, everywhere. The Ukraine right now, what they're doing, just to the Ukrainians themselves, so Jewish. It's so Jewish. And then, of course, the conduct of the Israelis right now. We are talking about the year 2024, and the Israelis are committing crimes against the Palestinians that were imaginarily leveled at the Germans against the Jews themselves. What the Jews are actually doing in Palestine is what they alleged the Germans to have done. The Germans' conduct, the Nazis' conduct, pales in comparison to what Jews are doing in the year 2024, when we're supposed to be ultra progressive.
Yeah, it's like the Jews are the real Nazis, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
they're living
And
it
that
out.
comes from them. They're the ones that turned it into that blaspheme, as it were.
And this is now the protocols, going into the protocols of the elders of Zion, and obviously what we're seeing today on the political world stage, which seems to be more of a grabbing for Jewish power. What's going on in Palestine, the infiltration to our Western governments, and these hate speech laws that are being made even in America. Not criminal yet, but could eventually be. With the protocols of the elders of Zion and the destruction of the European monarchies, Christianity, and the ushering of a Jewish world monarch. Talk about that, their goals to bring in a Jewish world leader.
So this is a very Christian perspective. And of course, the author, Father Ritter, believes in the Old Testament. And I mean, he's a Christian as far as we can discern here. So he does believe in like Revelation and all that. So I don't know about in particular like a Jewish monarch or this idea that the Antichrist, the son of perdition, is coming. That's what he argues. And I still encourage people, even if they're not Christian or religious, to read it. It's still very, very instructive. What I think is more revealing about his book is this concept of the Jewish exilarch, which started in London. This may just be an individual. I think that's what he's referring to. However, the Jewish exilarch could also be the concept of the 3 wise men and the 300 initiates, as it were. So these people are effectively the rulers of the world. And I would imagine that they are probably very prominent, secretive members of the World Economic Forum today. These are not going to be the people like Klaus Schwab that are trotted out before the masses. These are going to be the secret rulers, probably Rothschild, that kind of thing. Those are going to be the families. In fact, I would say that the families that are named in Albion and Zion United, the Sassoons, the Mons, the Goldsmiths, etc., Rothschilds, he names them all. Those are going to be your primary culprits behind the scenes. That's what I'm thinking. No one knows who these people are, unfortunately. I will get to a quote by Walter Rathenau, who was assassinated in Germany. He was the Jewish, let's see, he would have been not the president. I'm trying to think of the term. It starts with a P. And it's
Prime Minister?
Yeah, the prime minister. Okay, so he was the prime minister, well, effectively the prime minister of Germany at the time. During the Weimar Republic, that was Walter Rathenau. So he was assassinated by German nationalists, but he has an interesting quote about these 300. So in Judah Antichrist, he talks about the Jewish exilarch, which starts in London, but then transfers to New York. This is how he refers to it. The Jewish exilarch, his 3 wise men. So this would be one man, his 3 wise men. So these would be like high-level counselors, and the council of 300. So 300 other individuals that are all very high level. Effectively rule the entire world through the power of money. And of course, we know that Jews are overrepresented as far as wealth, billionaire, trillionaire, blah, blah, blah. So the majority of these people, if not all of them, are Jewish. Walter Rathenau confirmed that 300 men rule the world. And I believe, let me see if that's the correct page here. I want to make sure I get the right quote. Let me see. I want to come back to the protocols really quick and what they actually say, because that's important.
Got it. And just real quick, they don't really have to ever put out a world leader out in public, do they? They could just be as effective ruling the way they are now, kind of behind the scenes, unnamed.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's actually in Parasite, that quote. Let's see if I can find that really quick. I should have bookmarked it, but I didn't. Let me come back to that, because I have the page number in my notes. I just need to find it really quick. But let me just go into what the protocols actually, what they're all about. Now, the most important thing about this book is he establishes, in his view, why the protocols are legitimate. They're not a forgery. They're not a fraud. And he talks extensively about the Bern trial in Switzerland, none other than Switzerland, the land of Isis, the daughters of Isis. And there's weird stuff about Switzerland. I don't want to get into it too much, but I started looking into the research of Sean Ross, H-R-O-S-S. He's a strange cat. I'll admit it. He's weird. But he is 120% onto something with Switzerland. There's something weird about Jews, Freemasonry, Switzerland. They're all kind of intertwined. Another kind of private Jewish headquarters Switzerland can be. There's something about it. So we'll notice that all these Zionist congresses and the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, everything is always in Switzerland. So we have this Bern trial that took place in Switzerland. And it was supposed to have established that the protocols of the elders of Zion were this nasty, nasty anti-Semitic forgery. And it's interesting that they call it a forgery and not an outright fraud, because a forgery is a copy of something that was already written. And somebody had pointed that out to me before. I'm not the first one that came up with this. And I thought, well, that is strange. If it's a fraud, that means it was invented just out of the blue. But if it's a forgery, that means it's a copy of an original. When you forge someone's signature, there's an original to be forged. So what was it forged from and why? Well, he answers that. He answers that. So the good Father Ritter talks about Maurice Joly And he wrote something called Dialogues in Hell between Machiavelli and Montesquieu. That is the basis of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's very similar. But what's interesting is Mr. Joly was a Jacobin and a Freemason, and he had very close ties to the French Jewish community. Now, do we really think that this was just some anti-Semitic coincidence? No, it's not. So we're going to talk about the protocols and what they actually entail, and then we're going to ask ourselves, is this happening in real time? We need to really think about the COVID hoax, how Jews were pretty much, I would guess, 90 to 95% behind the whole COVID vaccination and shutdown effort. It was at least 90 to 95% Jewish. World Economic Forum, as I'm reading this, this is page 41 in Judah Antichrist. Why does Israel detest the protocols? Because they reveal a colossal plan for the establishment of a Jewish world empire and unveil an enormous global conspiracy. The world conquest program outlined in the protocols can be divided into two parts. One, the work of destruction. Two, the reconstruction. We are currently and have been in the period of destruction. It's not over yet. They have not completely destroyed what they've intended to destroy. Listen to this and tell me this isn't happening in America right now. The work of destruction approaches everything that nations possess in terms of material and intellectual goods, including state, finances, press, land ownership, home ownership. We're becoming a nation of renters, societal life, religion, education, art, and even the family, tranny children everywhere, with unheard of and diabolical sophistication. It's women's rights to abort. It's a woman's right to sacrifice her child to Moloch. It's the child's right to be a tranny, right? So this is the diabolical sophistication to which he refers. The plan for reconstruction, which we're not there yet, displays profound statesmanship, deep truth, and brilliant understanding of human nature and its laws, by which the humanity thrown into chaos is to be brought under strict order through a Jewish global regime. Politicians could learn true governance art from this part. So this isn't going to be like where you're going to be forced. It's going to be, oh, wow, that's so brilliant. It just makes sense. These people are going to be almost like prophets of reason and solution. That's how they're going to draw in the desperate Gentiles. And look at what they're doing to America and the world. The Ukrainians, they're being decimated. They're being genocided by their own leader, the Jew Zelensky. The Palestinians being genocided by Israel and given the green light by America. Americans being booted out of their homes by squatters. We have illegal immigrants swarming into the country unchecked. No one knows who or what they are. We have a nation of renters now because corporations like Vanguard and BlackRock are buying every single house built. This is what it is. This is what the Jews do. And this is exactly what the National Socialists were trying to warn the world about. And this is why Hitler had to round them up. They are a national security threat at every level, and you cannot see it otherwise. If someone is, they are lying or they are just stupid. So this
Yeah, I totally
it's such
agree.
an important book. Yeah, go ahead.
It definitely is. I mean, because like you said, the protocols, we're seeing the reality of them unfold right before our eyes in this generation. We're seeing America at total crisis with the border problem, the economy 34 trillion in debt, and like you said, I mean, people are not able to buy homes. What is it? I'm Gen X, but since Gen X, starting in Gen X, the generations that have had it worse than their parents, and it continues. And they've gotten Americans to be ashamed of loving their own country. We've gotten Christians being ashamed to say Christ is king. I'm sure you're familiar with that controversy, maybe not, but they've gotten Whereas throughout history, our ancestors knew how to deal with these people by basically kicking them out of their countries. And instead, we've welcomed them with open arms. And anybody who voices concern is quote unquote anti Semitic. And most people are afraid of these labels. So we're seeing this play out right before our eyes. And we're in this, like you said, this is, there's a scripture in the Bible that rabbis use. And it reminds me of what you just said, that people, the Gentiles, will be drawn into this kind of wanting what the reconstruction is going to be. And there's a scripture that says that 7 Gentiles will grab a hold of one Jew saying, let us go to worship your God with you in Zion. And that's kind of what it reminds me of. These rabbis love to quote that, believing that the Gentiles are going to submit to the Jews when their Moshiach comes, or when the Moshiach age comes.
Right.
And I don't know, the monarchy, it just seems that with the Protestant Reformation, and they had monarchies too, but that's where I kind of, so far in my study, have seen the break of the beginning of the end for monarchies. Where do you see the beginning of the end for monarchies? Like, where it really was, it the French Revolution, where kind of like the European monarchy really took a hit that it couldn't recover from?
That seems to be what's suggested in Jude Antichrist. And I think that's pretty true. And of course, that was very, very Freemasonic. Had everything to do with Freemasonry. Also, the attacks that happened, like touching off World War I, basically. So we had all these various assassinations going on. Even Hitler, like even a lot of the individuals in the National Socialist movement were kind of like, monarchies, it's pretty much passé. But when you look at what the fascists did, they were effectively monarchs. Authoritarian regimes are monarchies. I would call them neo-monarchies. So that's a very perfect substitute for monarchy, in my opinion. I think the authoritarian government and the quote-unquote dictator, as they like to call him, that's effectively the answer. It would be hard to bring monarchy back, but it's not hard to have like an authoritarian government, because those still exist. And I think ultimately the authoritarian governments like we see in North Korea and whatnot, those were a resurrection of the monarchy in an acceptable form without actually calling it a monarchy, so that they could get away with it. And that's why the democracies viciously attack authoritarian regimes, because it's the Jews seeing their traditional enemy monarchy rising again, and they feel the threat. They know it's a threat.
Right, because with a more authoritarian leader or leadership, then they know that they can't get away with what they're getting away with, which is basically bankrupting the nation morally and financially, which is kind of the history of, and you go back to the Bible with their ability to, the command to charge usury, but not against their own people. And we're seeing the consequences of a weakening of America not being able to deal with the Jewish problem. But it does seem to be that this was the original goal for America, to be the quote unquote new Jerusalem, like the Puritans envisioned. And they, the Puritans, it's in one of the books that you sent me that you've translated, that they envisioned the Native Americans as the Canaanites. They're using all these Old Testament motifs, just like today. The Israelis are using the Amalek motif for the Palestinians. They either call them Amalek or the Philistines. It's using these Old Testament motifs to justify horrific genocide, to justify usury, bankrupting nations.
Right.
Yeah. And they use if you curse Israel, you'll be cursed. You bless it, you'll be blessed. So when you can't even criticize them for, the pornography, them bringing the, porn industry into Germany, the Weimar Republic into America. So they have everything covered, and because Christians are advocates of the Old Testament as the holy book of God, they easily are beat into submission with these motifs.
Right. Exactly. And as long as you can castigate the Jews as, oh, well, you're deviating from your Yahweh, you shouldn't be doing that pornography and this and that. Well, if Jews were back to their true Judaism, they'd be good guys. They'd be totally acceptable to us Christians, but that is a part of the lie. And of course, that's in Moloch Yahweh. He says this whole castigating of Jews by their priestly class, it's nothing but a ruse. It's a facade. These people are evil at their core because they're worshiping an evil entity. And whoever your God is, that is you. Now, that's who you are. So when people show you who they are, believe them. I did find the quote. It's actually in Parasite. So I was right. You don't have this book yet.
Okay.
This one also feeds right into it. And wow, it's a mind-blowing book. I got to admit, it blew my mind. 300 men, and this is Walter Rathenau, himself a Jew. 300 men, each of whom knows every other, direct the economic destinies of the continent and choose successors from their environment. The strange causes of this strange phenomenon, which sheds a glimmer into the darkness of future social development, are not under consideration here. And apparently Rathenau said later on, after he made that statement statement caused him the most difficulties of his life. So it's kind of like when Kennedy talked about the secret societies and he was going to let the cat out of the bag, how he suddenly died. Isn't that interesting? That Walter Rathenau also let a cat out of the bag and he died.
That goes to show you that, these presidents that we've had since Kennedy,
Yep.
The Bushes, Ronald Reagan, Obama, now Donald Trump, and people look, on both sides of the fence, whether it's the left or the right, they're looking at these people as these saviors of our country, when in fact, if they were a true savior of America or looking to save America, they would be dead like Kennedy.
Yeah. It's all part of the game. And I think Judah Antichrist gets into that, where it doesn't matter if it's a nationalist, a communist, left or right, they're all dangled by the same Jewish puppet masters. The one entity and group that wasn't was the National Socialists. Now, what's kind of interesting, and I remember Wilf Heinck before he passed away, he's one of the older, he was like in his 80s when I met him, but he did a lot of translating with me before. And he had this thing where he was like, Veronica, how can Hitler have been like against them? Like, I don't understand. If everybody's on their strings, even the ones that go down, for example, Donald Trump, how can Hitler have been genuine? And I said, well, all of the data I've found, and I've done so much research, I've really dug and tried to find any kind of sellout behavior. And I think pretty much the only sellout behavior we found was in regards to Zionism. And even that was it doesn't matter, because Hitler was blackmailed, first of all. He was blackmailed by the Zionists. They said, would you like us to break the Jewish boycott against you that we ourselves are behind? And he goes, well, if it's going to save my country, yeah. And so Havana Agreement, that's how that came about. It was Jewish blackmail. We'll end the boycott against Germany, which is going to destroy your country economically, if you go along with our little immigration plan. But that immigration plan had started long before Hitler jumped into the fray. He did it reluctantly, and he always knew that Israel, the concept of a Jewish state, was merely going to be a world headquarters from which Jewry could rule the world more effectively. It gives them an additional level of power that doesn't exist for people that don't have a physical nation state. And that's very important. I want people to think about the Kurds. The Kurds desperately wanted a place to call their own. a homeland, a nation state. Without it, they are powerless. And so the Jews understood that in order to play in this world of Gentiles, one really has to have that home base, that piece of land that you can say, we're a nation, and here's the proof, here's the physical embodiment. And that's why they so desperately wanted Israel. And the Bible gave them that entitlement to the so-called Holy Land. We'll get into that later, because they don't have any entitlement at all. And that's based on genetics. But
Right. And, interesting too, going back to something you were just saying about this, when they're getting chastised by, let's say, a Christian Zionist or someone who's apologizing and saying, well, they're not being really Jewish. They're into these vile things like porn and whatnot.
right.
Chastising them because it's almost like, hey, be good Jews and you'll get to rule the world. So it's like pushing them in the direction of this Old Testament righteousness, where if they do good, they get to rule the world over the Gentiles. So it's like
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's always a win for them. It's a problem. It's a huge problem. Just finishing up with Hitler real quick. The only thing I could tell Wilf, and I would say to the audience listening, is that if you want to say that the National Socialists were kind of used in the respect that they created the case to be against National Socialism by being so quote unquote anti-Jewish, okay, there's some merit to that. But the Nazis themselves knew this. They knew this, and they talk about it. It's in Jude Antichrist, where he says, yeah, we the kings of anti-Semitism here, and he says it doesn't matter. This is you have to be anti-Jewish because these people are evil. So whether or not they use that as a means of solidifying the world against you or furthering their goals, that's it. It's irrelevant. This is morally right. This is to protect yourself from these people. You have to be anti-Jewish to survive. You sell out to these people, you'll die all the same. Look at America. Look at England. We sold out to Jewry. Would anyone want to live in England? I'm sorry, but even migrants are complaining about how horrific it is there. No jobs, no prosperity, dying nation. America, we've got major problems, major problems. And that's just it. The Jews destroy you all the same because it is who they are. Moloch told them, you will be the calamity of yourself and all nations. They are an eternal calamity, no matter what they do. So you might as well be anti-Jewish. And if they use that against you, so be it. If they use it to solidify the world against you, so be it. And
You make a
that's what
good
I would
point.
say.
It doesn't, like you said, it doesn't matter if they use that against you, if they use that to motivate them for their, to, get the cavalry. It's a morally right thing to be anti-Jewish.
Right.
Because
Exactly.
their worldview is a worldview of death and ugliness, whereas we talked about this before. The Aryan worldview is one of nobility, chivalry, and goodness and beauty in the arts. Well, the Jews are culture destroyers, and one of the ways they've destroyed cultures is by this Yahwehism. Because now, fast forward to 2024,
Mm-hmm.
at least what I see in America, it's largely among Christians, but of course it bleeds into other, segments like atheism. But everybody wants to be a Jew. I mean, whether it's the Hebrew, the Hebrew Israelites, Christian identity, everybody demonizes Roman culture. They, we have what is it like in most of these hospitals? They circumcise boys, genital mutilation. Um,
Right.
so it's like this Yahwehism has basically gotten people to abandon their own unique cultures and to adopt being a Shabbos Goy, or what do you want to call it? A Hebrew junior, Jew junior. These Christians that are
Right.
little Jew juniors running around.
Mm-hmm. Right. I would say one other thing that's proof in this respect is that if you look at who is it that Jews oppose and attack more viciously than any other entity in all of history, well, it's the National Socialists, and they come up with their Holocaust grim fairy tale to turn us against National Socialism permanently. So if Hitler and the fascist Italians and the Spanish fascists were all on Jewish strings, why are they so adamant against it? And I would say the same thing about Jesus. Now, the Moloch Yahweh book, that author is anti-Jesus. He believes that Jesus was just another one of the prophets that castigates Jews to bring them back in line to true Judaism. However, I disagree with that, and I think there's plenty of research that does contradict what Matizan says about Jesus. I would invite people to research both sides. But the only other entity that the Jews absolutely hate and just will not come to terms with is Jesus.
Right. Yeah, because in reading Jesus's teachings, they don't seem to be of a Jewish character. They seem to be of a more spiritual, where
Mm-hmm.
because he doesn't really teach a lot of the Old Testament, like the kind of the external rituals. Hey, you got to do this. That's more like inward type of spirituality.
Right.
And that's why I think a lot of people resonate with Jesus, even that may not be like traditional Christians or Christians, because these teachings are very spiritual. It's basically the way you treat people. And it really departs. And that's where the struggle has been in Christianity, where you have now this rise of this Hebrew roots movement. They're trying to make Jesus more kosher.
Mm-hmm.
And because they do realize that, the teachings of Jesus are not like Moses's. There's even some like diametrically opposed teachings to Moses.
Right.
So yeah, that's how I feel too, that Jesus is the opposite of the Jewish character, the opposite of the Jewish biospirit.
Right. And we have to keep in mind that, and I believe Matizan mentions that too, that Jews helped translate the Bible. So if we understand that they had a huge role to play in translating it into Greek, we can see that they could have introduced all kinds of their own little thoughts and ideas and even quotes attributed. So again, this was why it was so important to de-Judaize even the New Testament. As far as the Germans were concerned, they pulled all that out of that.
Well, yeah, and with the concept of the Marcionites, what they believed was that Christ ascended from heaven in the year 15. He ascended from heaven to earth. So what some people believe is that the purpose of the Gospels was to give Jesus a history, like a Jewish Israelite history, whereas Paul's Jesus and the Marcionite Jesus was, a spiritual being from heaven that came down, taught these good things, and that the Gospels, because it is proven that the Gospels were written after Paul's writings, that the Gospels were like the way to give Jesus a Jewish background,
Right.
probably
Yeah.
Judaizers. Yeah.
That kind of ties in with what Atwill wrote in Caesar's Messiah. So it could even be that the Flavian dynasty played a role in that. So in creating the Gospels in that Jewish story, that's something that people might want to consider too, is reading the Atwill thesis, Caesar's Messiah, and see how that fits in to that particular research, because that's what it reminds me of. He believes that the Flavian dynasty conspired to write the Gospels, and they had a Jew do it. Josephus, I believe it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, that's one book that down the line I want to get to. I've watched some of the videos, very interesting. And
Yeah.
now we've talked about, obviously capitalist Zionism and Bolshevism, and kind of like three heads of Jewish power. Do you have anything to add to that? Those three concepts, that ideologies that basically work for the same goal, and that's the the Judeo world order.
I would just add that Zionism, it wasn't really the creation of a state in the sense that we understand it. So like Gentiles would all generally want to be like in the same state, like Germans want to be in Germany, Ukrainians want to be in Ukraine. It was very ethnically based, and pretty much everybody wanted to be there. Now, with the Jewish introduction of the idea of mass immigration and colonialism with the English imperialism, that starts to shake things up and change that whole ethnic basis, familial basis of the nation state. So now we start seeing concepts like America and the USSR, where it isn't one particular ethnicity, but it's many ethnicities becoming one people. So this is where we still have Jews messing with things and screwing it up. But until America, USSR, these kind of international concepts come about, again, at the behest of Jews themselves, we had nation states that were effectively the greater family of any particular ethnicity. Zionism's different because it's pretty much 100% political in nature. It's a political state. And like the world, like the diaspora Jews, the world Jews never, ever, ever had any intention of living in a Jewish state. The idea was that they wanted a headquarters from which they could dominate the world more completely and give themselves an escape. So this whole right to return, that they can be dual citizens and no one else can, very important to the concept of Zionism. As far as Bolshevism, that was the idea of transferring all of Russia's wealth into the hands of a few Jews. So again, it was the wealth transfer concept. It had nothing to do with workers' rights and the proletariat. It had to do with using the proletariat as a battering ram against the czars so that the Jews could swoop in, take the position of the czars, and then take all the wealth for themselves. And that's effectively how they looted Russia. And then capitalism, it's the same thing. They get us all to buy into this idea that, oh, we'll lend to you. We'll have these banks and this and that. It's all about Jews creaming off the top. As Hitler said many times, they cream off the top. They don't create. They don't contribute. They cream off the top of the Goyim's labor. So we're the ones that produce, we work, and the Jews cream off the top, whether it's interest or some other form, taxation. They run the IRS. The Federal Reserve basically took the power, monetary power from our Congress and put it into the hands of a private Jewish bank. That was brilliant. All of these things. Capitalism is an absolute ruse against the Gentiles who partake of it. And we need only wake up and we will eventually see that. It doesn't mean you can't have trade and capitalism. We can still have a capitalist system. You just have to remove the Jewish element from it and the idea that money rules people. Hitler said, no, capital does not rule work. Work rules capital. We are going to invert this concept. Labor must come first. The nation, the people must come first. If the money does not serve the interests of this people and the work and things it produces, then it's worthless. And that's
because they're the
another
money
reason why they hated him.
Yeah, they're the money speculators. They make money off of money.
Right.
And so money's become like their labor, like making money, speculating, the bear and bull markets, the stock market.
Oh, that's 100% Jewish.
Yeah. It is.
That's in Albion and Zion United, everybody. He talks about the beginning of the Jewish stock exchange, and he even mentions the roller coaster that Jews keep creating for us. The boom and bust cycle is 100% contrived, invented, created by Jews. There is no boom and bust. It's artificial. and they do it on purpose. And you'll notice that with every crash, an incredible amount of wealth goes into the hands of just a few little Jews up there every time.
And this is when you see capitalism, well, at least like you said, the Jewish version of it, and you look at our nation, how materialistic people are, how it doesn't matter the character of people anymore. You know, someone running a company, someone, you know, athletes, whatever matters, you know, how much money they make, their salaries. I mean, people are so obsessed with money. It's become this god to them. And this is, again, that Jewish, you know, materialism on steroids. And Christians now practice this materialistic mindset too, this love of money, and this, it's money is king. And you see this in our culture with the decadence and just the gaudy materialism people love to show. You know, it's just, yeah. And you see what unbridled capitalism does. It creates people that are unhealthy, literally unhealthy physically. It feeds into the whole, you know, more greed.
It really is the root of all evil, and it comes mostly from Jews. As we know, there's a reason they said money is the root of all evil.
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, and they have "In God We Trust" on our money. So
and really it should be Moloch we trust. I mean,
I
it's
was
all
just going to say that. Is that the
imagery.
Moloch Yahweh God?
Yeah, that's the problem, everybody. It's actually in Moloch we trust. And when you start seeing it that way, everything changes. I'll tell you, it's a life-changing book. It has made me see the world completely different.
I totally recommend it, and it will change your life and change the way you view things. All the books I've read so far is Albion and Zion United, Judah Antichrist, War Was with the Iron Cross, and we'll, you know, when we close, you can mention your website or your page where people can request these books from you. What do you think, you know, the goal of establishing, you know, a Jewish majority in Palestine, kind of, it hits to what's going on today. And you can even, if you want, in this question, to get into the genetics of their right to that land or lack of a right to that land. So on page 74 of Albion and Zion United, the final aim of the Zionists is basically to expel the Palestinians from that land, where now we're here and we're seeing that this is what it looks like is happening, a genocide and expulsion of the ones who don't get killed, to, you know, basically leave.
Right. So initially they wanted to do it through mass immigration. So again, this is kind of why they really wanted Hitler on board, and they exploited the anti-Semitism that was in Germany, and rightfully so. Rightfully so as far as the anti-Semitism, not the exploitation by the Jews, but they just wanted to get as many Jews in Palestine as possible to push the Arabs out. And this was all fulfillment of the Balfour Declaration, which in Albion and Zion United, the author, I think it's Wolf Meyer Christian or Christian Meyer, he really gets into the details of the beginning, middle, and end of the Balfour Declaration, how it started, what it became, and how it became what it did. It was never intended to be like this carte blanche, here's your Jewish state. But the Jews in power in the British aristocracy, and of course Chaim Weizmann, made it so. They kept tweaking the language and putting pressure on Britain like they do on our government, and they got them to buckle. So then it became a Jewish state, and the Arabs were just basically written out of their own state. This is really interesting, and this comes from Mr. Jabotinsky in 1925. On page 175 of Albion and Zion United, he says, "There can never be any mention of a reconciliation between the Palestinian Arabs and us. Not now or in the foreseeable future." And of course, here we are today, same problem. "I voice my conviction in this way because I do not enjoy offending the well-meaning. I also don't believe that they are offended, save for those who refuse to open their eyes because they, the British, themselves have come to the conclusion that it is impossible to ask the Arabs to voluntarily agree to a changeover of Palestine from an Arabian state to a country with a Jewish majority. Well, duh. I mean, of course, the Arabs don't want to give their country to these Jews that are coming from Europe. So, the goal of Zionism, the aim as written by Mr. Jabotinsky, the aim of Zionism is the gradual transformation of Palestine, including Transjordan. They also wanted Transjordan at the time, into a Jewish commonwealth. That is, into a self-governing commonwealth under the auspices of an established Jewish majority. Do we not see that that was the beginning of the end, everybody? It just, give me a break. There was never, ever, ever going to be a two-state solution. From the beginning, it was Jewish state only. And they will fulfill that. They're going to force that. And they're doing it now. Two, this formula is the only admissible interpretation of the term national home in the Basel program. And of course, we're talking about Basel, Switzerland, the Balfour Declaration, and the mandate. And that's the British mandate. The British were in control of Palestine at the time. And number three, all official documents containing any other interpretation of the aim of Zionism are declared invalid. Transjordan is an inseparable part of the territory of Palestine, and similarly to all other parts of the Jewish Commonwealth, and will be included in the sphere of Jewish colonization. So they pretty much said from the beginning, back in 1925, that it will be a Jewish state, and nobody has anything to say about it otherwise.
Do you believe that what's happened with Palestine in the gradual Jewish and then, kind of not so gradual Jewish takeover, and now what we're seeing happen, the genocide and the gaslighting of the Palestinians by the Jews, do you think that's a microcosm of what happened here in America with basically the European Christians, Puritans, and the Native Americans? Maybe it's oversimplification, but do you think that's kind of what we're seeing, the promises being broken, where it's originally kind of more, it's not as one-sided, and now we see the one-sidedness and all these agreements that now they've been retracted by the Jews?
Oh, I would say it's a very similar situation. And that's just it. All the agreements that were made with the Native American nations were never meant to be honored by the colonists. And maybe that's a bitter pill for fellow white folk to swallow, but it's true. But we have to understand European behavior, namely Anglo-Saxon, because we really need to make a differentiation between continental Europeans and the Anglo-Saxons, the Pan-Angles, as it were. They have uniquely nasty Jewish behavior as an entity. And it just is a fact. To this day, the British are, and particularly the English, I'm not really talking about the Welsh, the Irish, and the Scottish. It's the English in particular that just, whatever Jews do, wow, how can we worship you harder? It's just, I don't get it. It's so bizarre. But again, it goes back to that religious foundation, to Cromwell letting the Jews back in after they were banished from England, because he knew that they had wealth and that he could help them create English imperialism, and that's what he wanted. It just goes back to that religious basis. And I think that's why the Albion and Zion book is so important to read. You just can't understand it. And even after you read that, you really still, it's like, why is that still to this day the case? Where the English have this tie to Israel.
Yeah, and that's from section C, page 254, the religious alliances basis for the political, giving what we talked about before, British Israelitism, giving the British a theological reason to support the Jews by saying you're Ephraim, and then now to America, oh, you're Manasseh. So it's this three-headed monster that is very Judaized, and you see the same type of violence against the Palestinians, very Jewish in nature, the brutality of it. You saw the same with the Native Americans. And like you said, there has to be a distinction made with like the Anglo-Saxons and other European groups, because this is You see like I've dealt with it personally, knowing people from England that have been heavily supportive of Israel no matter what they do.
Hmm.
And it's this theological poison that was given to them centuries ago, like you said, when Cromwell welcomed them back, and to the point where many people, even today, believe that the throne in England is the throne of David.
Right, right. The British Israelites from Isaac's son, Anglo-Saxon. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a big thing going on right now, where I think the cope for a lot of white Christians is now to claim that they are the real Israelites. I'll be honest, I fell into it for a little bit of a time,
Uh-huh.
but it's really a cope, and you're actually making yourself more of a slave to them by going that route.
Right. No, it's just no good to be Jewish, or you don't want to be that. No one
Right,
should want to be that. It's not good. It's evil. It is evil
exactly.
at its core. Yeah. And I mean, I remember reading the Old Testament when I was younger and still ignorant about Jews. You know, when I was like a teenager or whatever. I was raised Catholic. And I thought, God is hideous. It's horrible, God. How can this be the same entity? How can this be Jesus's father? It blew my mind how horrible and icky. And I'm just like, why does he unleash all this horror and evil and hatred on everybody? It never made sense to me. I always hated it. I always had a problem with it. And so I think it's a problem for everybody. I mean, even like priests and pastors that are masters in theology, they don't understand it. I mean, if we think about it at its core level, we're supposed to believe that God created the Garden of Eden, put Adam and Eve there, right? Makes Eve out of Adam, and then allows Satan to come into the garden. He had to allow Satan to come in, knowing that he would tempt man, and wanted him and let him have the knowledge that then led to his fall. What kind of loving father is this? I just
Yeah.
remember, this pastor. He's like, I don't even really understand it. I'm like, yeah, because it doesn't make any sense unless you realize all of this stuff is Jewish mumbo jumbo evil.
Well, it's the big elephant in the room, or I should say, a lot of elephants in the room, because you can't explain the stuff away and still come out with a loving God as Jesus portrays the Father, in the New Testament.
Right. His father must be a different entity. That gentleman from Ukraine, I'll just mention it briefly because it's an interesting thesis. I'm just going to say it's interesting. It's something, you know, um, people that research Christianity might want to look into more. You might be interested. He seems to be suggesting that Lucifer is Jesus, that those are the same entity, and that Lucifer has been turned into Satan, conflated wrongly by Jews themselves to turn us against Lucifer. Because if you read in Revelation, Jesus refers to himself as the morning star. And of course, Lucifer's well known as the morning star. So there's some interesting parallels there where Lucifer brought knowledge to man. He enlightens mankind. Jesus enlightens mankind against Judaism, brings them to the light, lets them know, hey, this is no longer valid. This is garbage. I've come to fulfill the law. You don't need to follow the Jewish law anymore. There's some interesting parallels there that might just have some legitimacy. So I just thought that was interesting information.
Well, no, it's funny that you bring that up, because I just had a debate with someone on YouTube, not a literal debate, but just kind of some comments back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in the book of Isaiah, where Lucifer is mentioned, a lot of people think that's Satan, but it's not. It's just referring to the king of Babylon, and Lucifer is just a title. It means exactly what you said, the bright and morning star, which Jesus is called in the book of Revelation, and a couple other places called day star, morning star. So it's a
Right.
title of a king. And so and Jesus is
Mm-hmm.
a king. So in I believe in the Latin Vulgate, which was one of the first translations of the Bible, Jesus is called Lucifer in, I think, the book of Peter, one of the epistles of Peter. So he's
Mm,
actually, so in the original, one of the original Bibles, it's in Latin, he's called Lucifer, which, like you said,
interesting.
it just simply means bright and morning star. It's not the red guy that I think,
Right.
the churches later on conflated just to, I don't know why, but like you said, there could be an ulterior motive where
There
now when
was
people think of
apparently
Lucifer,
Jews
yeah,
behind that.
yeah, definitely, because you hear about all this, the Luciferians, Lucifer, but again, going to Isaiah,
Hmm.
uh, that's not even about Satan. It's just about the king of Babylon, and it's a kingship
Right.
title, of which, of course, if we believe Jesus is king as Christians, he's the bright and morning star, and in the Latin Vulgate, it was translated as Lucifer.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad I mentioned that.
Yeah, and I just had this discussion because people will make videos. Oh, look at the Catholic Church; they're singing to Lucifer. Well, yeah, it's in Latin. Of course, they're singing to Lucifer. I just went to a Catholic mass a few weeks ago. They sang it in English, but they mentioned Morning Star. If she had
Hmm.
sang that song in Latin, it would have been Lucifer. But it's all to Jesus.
Right. And there's problems because people have conflated Moloch, Baphomet, Lucifer, the devil, Satan. They've all become like one and the same. And it's like, no, people. These are all different entities. Moloch is not Baphomet, is not Satan, is not the devil. They have it all screwed up. And depending on if you read Jewish texts versus Christian texts, even Satan and the devil are different. The Jews call everyone the devil if it's just an enemy. If you're their enemy, they'll say, you devil. It doesn't mean literally the devil. So there's some real translation and interpretation issues happening there.
Right. It means adversary, and um,
Right.
yeah, and a lot of the even the word world in the Bible, and the word world there is definitely a mistranslation. Um, but yeah, so again, like when I tell people and I point out the Jews as being the problem in our world,
Mhm.
they'll say, no, it's the Luciferians.
Oh,
Because
brother.
like you said, the Jews have really did a number on Christians with conflating Satan with Lucifer when it has nothing to do with Satan.
Right, right. So, real quick, you wanted me to mention the DNA. Okay, so this is
Yes.
a very recent study, and I put it into the parasite book because it's very important. There's a chapter on the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim in this book. So I thought, well, that's a perfect place to put the whole DNA thing, just, as a side note in the chapter. So the Ashkenazi Jews, they do have a basis in the Middle East, but the problem is it was so long ago that really the main foundation of the Ashkenazim is Iran, Persia. So they were the majority in the Persian Empire. They emigrated to a region of Eastern Europe for the purpose of trade. And so they are actually a very mixed race people of Persian. Their basis is Persian Jewry. So they more than likely took on Persian blood and other blood as they lived there. But they also took on a huge amount of Khazar blood. So, yes, the Ashkenazim are in fact the Khazars. There's absolute legitimacy to that thesis. But they also have what was called the Ashina tribe. These are the Gok Turks, an Asiatic tribe that was there in Eastern Europe at the time. So the Ashina put some of their DNA into the Ashkenazim, and then you had the Eastern Europeans that also infused the Ashkenazim. So if you go by DNA, strictly by DNA, the Ashkenazi Jews, who are the majority in the world and in Israel, can only trace 3% of their DNA to the Middle East region. Most Europeans themselves can trace 1 to 3% of their DNA to the Middle East. So I guess we're all entitled to live in Palestine, everybody. I want my
Yeah.
right to return right now.
Yeah, it must be nice this time of year.
It is an absolute lie that they have any tie to the Holy Land. And again, this is why it's so important to expose their Molochism, their lack of DNA, that they don't have a genetic basis in Palestine. They don't have a religious basis in Palestine.
Right. And, I've been reading up on it a little bit, going like about the Semites, right? Because this is what they're claiming, they're Semitic. Now,
Right.
maybe you know more about this, and this is probably going to not sit well with the Christian identity folk, is from what I've understood about the Semites, during the times of the Egyptians. And I know the Semites had different tribes, so they weren't necessarily the Semitic Hebrews or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, our history is so messed up, but maybe you know more about this than I do. What I've seen on like these, where they've shown the hieroglyphs, it looks like the Semites were like kind of a Moroccan looking people, where they seem to be like kind of bronze skinned with
Right.
black hair. Do you know anything about that?
I have come across a little bit about that they were originally not like black, but I guess possibly what people would have defined as black back then in ancient times, dark skinned. So definitely not the same people we're seeing in Israel. It's completely ridiculous to say. I mean, the Nazis have this incredible amount of research that went into everything. They studied the Jewish question like inside and out, the migrations, everything. And these people are effectively Eastern Europeans. So this idea that they have some right to be in the Middle East, that they're Semites, that we should even be using the term anti-Semitism, it's ludicrous. It doesn't make any sense. And the thing is they're so mixed from the time when the Semitic peoples, the actual Hebrews, were actually in the original Middle East region, wherever, whatever we want to call it, the biblical Holy Land, so to speak. That group is not even remotely the same group that exists today. That would be like saying the people that lived in Germany, I don't know, back when Neanderthals still roamed the earth, they're the same exact people that live in Germany today. Nobody would be so stupid to say that. There's been too much mixing that's happened from wars, from migration, etc. So this idea that the Jews are the same people as the Hebrews of the Bible, it's asinine. Yes, the same basis, perhaps the same culture, the same Moloch god, but not racially or genetically the same, not even remotely. Again, we're saying 3% of their DNA traces them to the Middle East region. How is that the same people?
Right. And yeah, and from what I understand, and I have to look into this further, the original Semitic peoples don't even exist anymore. I mean, they've been bred out or mixed because there's been tons of migrations, admixtures in the Middle East, and just like most everywhere. So they don't even
Right.
exist the way they were in the Old Testament, like as a racial group of people anymore.
Right. Now, in Parasite on page 37, the author writes, after the destruction of Jerusalem, Judaism was divided into two groups through dispersion. One group spread over Turkey, the Balkan countries, Hungary, northern Italy, Germany, Austria, Galicia, Poland, South and West Russia, while the other covered the territory of the greater Arab cultural circle, North Africa, and the Mediterranean countries up to Spain. So, in all honesty, the Sephardic that stayed more in the Middle East would have more claim to the Palestinian territory than the Ashkenazi. And the Sephardi get run like they're treated like garbage. They were treated like second class slaves when the Ashkenazi went into Israel. And I don't know if people are familiar with the ringworm children, but there were experiments conducted on the Sephardim by the Ashkenazim. There were all kinds of crimes committed against the Sephardim by the Ashkenazim. They're not good people. They're what
No, they're not.
Andrew Carrington Hitchcock referred to as the synagogue of Satan, which you can no longer say on X now, by the way, I guess. You can't use that term, synagogue of Satan, because it's true. They don't want you talking truth on there.
Right, and that's the thing that we're seeing now. And YouTube isn't what it used to be. I mean, you get if you say boo, people get get your videos taken down and shadow banned, if not outright
Right.
canceled. And synagogue of Satan's a trigger now, and saying Christ
Right.
is king. Now, do you
Christ is king is now like saying Heil Hitler.
right?
It's
Yeah,
incredible.
it's to that point now that Christians themselves are making YouTube videos. These are influential Christians in the Christian world, the Protestant evangelical world, and they're telling Christians to be careful about saying it because others who are saying it with ulterior motives, quote unquote. So they are encouraging Christians not really to say it anymore. That's how far Christianity has fallen.
Yeah, that's bad.
Yeah.
Bad sign.
Very bad. Now, what about the similarities between Judaism and Puritanism? Both are capitalistic. Both encourage the accumulation of wealth, and both operate under chosen people ideology. And historically, have been ruthless to its enemies. We talked a lot about this. So if there's anything else you want to add, feel free. But definitely, those two ideologies are very similar.
Yeah, we pretty much covered it. The idea of wealth and prosperity has to do with Yahweh's blessings, and it has nothing to do with advantage or disadvantage, your birth standing, your social standing, how hard you work. You were predestined by God, and if you're wealthy, you were predestined as a chosen one. If you're poor, you were damned by God. And that's the whole Calvinist Puritan predestination concept. So the English naturally believed with that basis, oh, the Jews are wealthy, so they must be blessed and chosen by Yahweh as well. So you can see how the two just touched off perfectly there. And the English and the Jews both like to do the philanthropy thing. I don't know if people notice, but the British royalty to this day, oh, we're philanthropists. Of course you are. That makes up for all the sins. So they believe that they can make it right with God simply by doing good works. It has nothing to do with Jesus. He didn't save anyone. You save yourself. And see, that's what the Jews believe.
Right. Very, very Torah-centric type of mentality. Just do these good works, do these rituals, do things for show. Now, this goes into the next question. How does today's Christianity further Jewish supremacy?
So the Christian Zionists, everybody knows that they believe that Israel has a role to play in biblical prophecy. They have to fulfill the prophecy, blah, 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 which is just complete nonsense. Again, the more you realize this Moloch thing, the more you realize, wow, most of the Bible needs to just be discarded. So they feel this obligation to defend the quote unquote chosen people. That idea of the chosen people must go. The only way you should ever think of Jews as chosen is chosen by Moloch. They are damned by a demon. And so, yeah, he gives you incredible power, but at a very great cost. As we can see, they're destroying the entire world. So as long as Christians are in the dark about the Moloch, and they continue to believe that Jews are chosen by God, not by Moloch, then the whole Jewish biblical-based privilege and power will continue. Because Jews have, it's like everyone believes, these Christians believe that Jews can do whatever they want because the Bible says so. They're the chosen people. It's crazy. And the Jews know it. And this is why, like their new targeting system, they have a new AI targeting system called Gospel. Now tell me that that isn't somehow to kind of hoodwink Christians. Yeah, our AI that's murdering all the Palestinians, we called it gospel. Like the gospel of Jesus, gospel of St. John.
Yeah,
So
it's to the point where if you are against Jews murdering people and destroying and genociding an ethnic group, you're anti-Semitic if you don't want them to do that. I mean, we live in a bizarre world right now where everything is turned around. Right is wrong, wrong is right. This is the Judeo worldview. It's the
Hmm.
parasitic people that want to destroy cultures, you know.
Right, right. And the only way you can see, like now that I've read that book, the only way I can see the whole Israeli action in Palestine is this is Israel enacting the ban against Palestine, which is just genocide. When they banish you, they kill you. So they eliminate you completely. And then this whole war against quote unquote Hamas is simply their ritual sacrifice to Moloch. They can no longer sacrifice their firstborn, so they're sacrificing the Palestinians. This is ritual murder. It is genocide. It is nothing more. Long lived Jewish cultural tradition. And people need to realize that when you do abortion, has nothing to do with women's rights. And the Judah Antichrist book talks about this. Before it was to protect mothers, now it's women's rights. It's kind of evolved. It is Moloch worship. You are doing child sacrifice. You are sacrificing your child to Moloch. The Jews are 100% behind abortion, and they always have been. It is their way of covertly getting other people to do the sacrifice of their religion. And they've done it very cleverly.
Right. And just like you have abortion, which is child sacrifice to Moloch, you have genital mutilation with the transgender movement, and of course the baby boys in the hospitals that are born, let's mutilate them. Now you have the circumcision, which is both
Right,
transgenderism and this baby circumcision,
right.
and again, they're culture destroyers. So they are against the natural world, which is where we get the Aryan worldview, the worldview of nature and chivalry and purity, versus the Judeo worldview, which is all about destroying other people's cultures. This is why I'm big on people, get Christians at least getting away from identifying, because even the Christians that don't claim to be a Hebrew Israelite or a spiritual Israelite, they'll say, well, I'm an inward Jew. They're quoting the book of Romans. I'm an inward Jew, not
Hmm.
realizing that Paul's writing to Jews, not Gentiles there. But and I try to encourage Christians, that Jesus came to save all tribes, tongues, peoples, and nations. You don't have to lose your culture and give it up because you become a Christian and become this like Jew light, Jew 0 calories. Just be who you are, enjoy your culture, and believe in Jesus. But that's where we're at today, and that's part of this mind screw that because you could become a Christian, you have to support Israel at all costs, not knowing that, again, even if you take the Old Testament and say, okay, well, I'm going to believe in it. I mean, these
Hmm.
prophecies are obviously have nothing to do with today. A lot of people, when they watch the news, they're thinking, okay, this is in the book of Revelation or this is in this prophecy. And it's really not, because that was written in the first century with the first century mindset. And people are stretching these devastating Old Testament prophecies into 2024, thinking they're still relevant. Where, like I said, even if you did believe in the Old Testament, these things they were already fulfilled. They're not relevant today.
Right.
So, what do you think the future holds? In the near and distant future, in light of the events that are going on right now in Palestine and Russia, Ukraine, respect to the goals of the Zionists.
Okay, well, we know that Ukraine is 100% Jewish war. This has nothing to do with America or Ukraine. It's not in either of our interests. This is a Jewish war against Russia. And Russia's being banned. And why? Why has Russia fallen under Israel's ban? Because Russia's a threat to the unipolar world order. And if America is basically the basis of Jewry's wealth, without America, they do not have that wealth that they have amassed. We're talking trillions. The Rothschilds and whatnot must be worth trillions at this point. So if England and America fall, which really the two are tied together even to this day, and Russia becomes a world power, which it's finally broken the chains of Soviet, the post-Soviet era and is coming to its own for once, that's a threat to Jewish money and therefore a threat to their political power. So they see Russia rising and China rising, obviously, as a threat. So that's why America is threatening everybody. China, we're going to defend Taiwan. And then, Russia, you better watch yourself. We're going to nuke you or whatever. It's so stupid. As though America has the military, first of all, the boots on the ground. Good luck with that one. But even just the weaponry and the military ability, it's not going to happen. You can't take on 2 or 3 fronts. And that's what they're trying to do. And now we're going against Iran because that's Zionism's endgame. It's a huge part of it. They have to render Iran powerless. They've already eradicated Iraq. That was taken down with Saddam Hussein. So now we have to take out Iran for them so that they can have undisputed influence and power in the Middle East. They can't have any local threat against their state because that's the political basis of their world power. They have to have that. We talked about that. You got to have that piece of land you call home. So you can't have Hamas and Iran and all these little guys threatening that peace. So that's number one. But number two, you can't have Russia and China threatening America because that's Jewry's wealth. And you can't keep the Zionist state without the Jewish wealth and vice versa. So we see how this is all about Jewry. If you take Jews completely out of the picture of what's going on in the world today, would America be at war with Russia over a tiny little sliver of the Ukraine? It doesn't make any sense at all. None whatsoever.
And that's the interesting thing, is because we see the Jews destroying the West, but they actually need the West to be stronger than the East, because when the East rises up and the West falls, then there goes the Zionist world order, right? I mean, there goes, if they can't keep the West, and specifically America, as the most powerful nation in the world, then the Jewish world order goes down right along with America. So it's an interesting situation where they want to weaken the West with, like I said, mass immigration, capitalism, but at the same time, they need the West to kind of stay stronger than the East, it seems like.
That's the curse of Moloch. So as it says, I will completely destroy all the peoples among whom I have scattered you, my Israel. I will bring disaster on all the nations where I've driven you. So do not be afraid, my servant Jacob. So everywhere they go, they destroy the nation to which they've gone. This is their calamity. Goes back to the Bible. This is what happens when you follow Moloch. They're cursed and blessed simultaneously. And the Jews simultaneously want to destroy and rule the world. You can't do both, and yet they're doing both. It is just in their nature. There's no other way to explain it. They're not like any other people. And I think the Parasite book, really, there's no other book I've ever read that hits that point on the head more than that one. It's really, really remarkable. And that was actually written for the Wehrmacht, specifically for the Wehrmacht, for all soldiers, officers, etc. I believe it was 1944. Let me see. Yes, it was 1944. Warfare Journals of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces. It was published by the National Socialist Leadership Staff of the Armed Forces, originally. So the Germans understood.
Yeah.
Well, they tried to warn America too. It's in this book. It's in Parasite, where they said, America, you're doomed. You might not see it now. You think you're on top of the world. Gosh, you think you're so wealthy and you're just untouchable. But man, you have no idea what's coming. You just don't get it. And look at what has happened to this country. There's not one person I can talk to today, even liberals, that can get their head around what's happened.
Yeah, and I've noticed a lot of liberals that I've talked to are despondent about what they're seeing, and now a lot of even well-known liberals in the social media world are jumping off Joe Biden's bandwagon. But of course, there's really no solution to this other than what we've talked about, a fusion of Christianity and National Socialism. And what's crazy is this is how you're in the Jewish, you're a slave spiritually and mentally to the Judeo worldview, that you're really spiritually a slave, is that Christians in the West are cheerleading what's going on in Israel, not just because, it's the chosen people, but they actually think they need to see these type of genocides in order to usher in Jesus coming back. That's how sick this mindset is, that they actually cheerlead these wars and they rejoice, oh, it means Jesus is coming back sooner. That's the sickness.
Absolutely. And it's just like the National Socialists said. And Hitler was the one that allegedly told it to Wagner. He said, the Jews do need to be in their own state. That would be a good solution to the Jewish problem. However, until all the nations of the world are on board with this and understand it, really understand the Jewish problem, there's no rush, because otherwise it's going to be a problem. And look at what Israel has become. It is nothing but a world pariah. It is a problem for all nations now. And the Jews never went to live there. They've got more power than ever in their host countries. And now they're causing absolute international calamity. So they've made the problem worse. And this is what Hitler tried to warn of when he was speaking to Wagner. And that was in the I think that was the late 1920s, early 1930s when those conversations allegedly took place. So the final solution to the Jewish problem, as it should be, would be to put them in their own territory, but they cannot, as Alfred Rosenberg said, they cannot rule themselves and they can't be sovereign. That's
right,
the solution.
Devour each other.
The world has to rule the Jews together collectively. They cannot have any say, any power whatsoever, none. And they cannot be allowed into other nations, because as soon as they get their foot in the door, they start taking control of those countries. They do it step by step. And the process is explained in Albion and Zion United. One need only read that history. It's 100% historical. There isn't one drip of hate in there. He doesn't say one hateful word against Jews. It's simply history. It's historical fact. He demonstrates exactly how it was done, how they got into England and slowly took over the entire British Empire through the aristocracy. Right. It's remarkable. It really is remarkable. Very good book. That's also like a super important book to read. They all are, really. And these were all National Socialist books. These are translations.
That's the thing, too, is we see now, they infiltrated the British Empire, or now in America, they've infiltrated politics. And of course, in both cases, they give them a theological reason to the Americans and before them, the British, to support them. And so now you have this neoconservative Christian Zionism on steroids, and it's just, and here we are now. But the problem, obviously, there's been one solution in the last few hundred years, and that's been National Socialism, which was positive Christianity. Veronica's been great talking to you. Tell people where, if they want to get any of these great books like Moloch, Yahweh, Albion and Zion United, Judah Antichrist. You mentioned Parasite, and there's many other books. How can they reach you if they wanted to purchase these books?
They just have to go to the website. It's vilkmotzipublishers.com.
Got it. Yeah, and I'll post a link to once I put this video on YouTube and BitChute. But do you have any final thoughts before we close?
I think we pretty much got it all. I'm good.
Yeah, thank you. This has been super informative, and I just continue to learn more when I read these books. And I encourage anybody to just keep your mind open. I mean, you don't have to give up your faith, but at least consider things. And my Christianity is stronger than ever because I'm focusing on Jesus and not on the Old Testament. All right, Veronika, thank you. And it was great having this discussion with you. And I'm sure we'll have more in the future as I read more of these books.
Yes, I think this was a very, very important and powerful discussion. So thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Veronika. Have a great day.
Okay, you too.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.